Hello and welcome to episode 11 of season 2 of A is for Architecture with me, Ambrose Gillick. For this recording, I spoke with Dr. Jos Boys, architect, scholar, teacher and activist, about her work with the Disordinary Architecture Project.
It's a political issue, which is that we should value the richness of our neuro and biodiversity. And actually we don't. We tend to kind of focus on supporting a normal group of people, a normate group of people, and then kind of inviting in, but, rather absent-mindedly, the others, the non-normal. So one thing is just about that, about what it means to think that we do actually value that kind of diversity, and that's something that is the richness of humanity is something we should enjoy and not try and kind of close down.
A is for Architecture, a podcast about architecture, buildings, urban culture and space.
Hello and welcome again to A is for Architecture. I'm talking today to Jos Boys, Dr. Jos Boys. Jos, would you be so kind as to introduce yourself?
Yes, hi there. Yes, I'm Jos, and I studied architecture in the 1970s in London, so quite a long time ago. But I was one of those people, one of a whole group of younger middle-class white women who came into architecture in the kind of post-war period, and from a much wider range of backgrounds than perhaps architecture, which is still a bit of a gentleman's club, but it was expanding. It was the beginning of an expansion of different sorts of people coming into architecture. And I came from suburban South London. I didn't really know what architecture was. I actually wanted to do photography, but my school said I couldn't be. Girls could not be photographers because the equipment was too heavy, which is kind of hilarious, but also because it was one of those scholarship schools, and the idea, there was a sense that photography was commerce and that at least architecture was a proper profession. So I came in and I went to the Bartlett School of Architecture, which is part of UCL. It wasn't called the Bartlett at the time because it was going through a really radical patch. And I think what was really interesting to me was feeling quite a misfit, not in terms of the discussions that were had, not feeling that I was struggling with the way that you learn design, but very much about what the underlying principles were. There seemed to be a kind of set of assumptions about what architecture was and how you did it that were never really explained, and I couldn't really understand why this was the way that we worked. It was the tail end of kind of very high modernism. So a lot of our tutors designed in a very Corbusian way, really, and didn't seem to be able to explain why that was a good way to design. And we all muddled through. Some people would just hook onto that, but we muddled through and did some really dreadful things that, now tend to be called things like neo-vernacular or postmodern or regionalism, and me, many of my friends did it much better, but, did it really quite badly because I couldn't work out what was going on. But at the same time, I think it made me fall completely in love with architecture because it was also quite very different, really, to the pressures I think a lot of architecture and built environment students feel now. It was quite a kind of weird hippie time. So the first thing they taught us to do when I went to architecture school was how to douse for water. They gave us, Y-shaped twigs, took us out into Hyde Park and showed us how the twigs could find water. And we did a bit of cybernetics and we did a bit of general systems theory. We did quite a lot of Marxism. And we were taught by people like, we had an American tutor in first year from day one who he left because he was going diving for Atlantis in the Bermuda Triangle. So it was kind of wonderfully crazy. And I really liked that. But there were these parallel threads that didn't really fit together.
Yeah.
And then out of that, a lot of us, I think, got quite involved in community action because London was very much a centre of, it was very, London in that period was pretty derelict. People had, the whole of the Bloomsbury area was basically falling down. And so it was possible to squat and live very cheaply. And I was involved in a group that squatted in Covent Garden to try and save it from there was an intention to drive like a motorway through the middle of Covent Garden. And lots of other people at the school were involved in other kinds of community action around Euston Station, down on the South Bank. And so that was kind of, again, that's like a third thread. And that really wasn't through what we were being taught. I think that was through what was happening around us to a very large degree. And so I guess that was the thing that influenced me most. And it was really about, out of this sense of not fitting in, of being a bit of a misfit, I think I got very interested in how you might change architectural practice. And again, that connected to quite a lot that was going on around kind of equal participation and involvement of more marginalized groups, whether that was women or people of color or community groups.
That's really interesting. It's this idea of an activist architecture. So you're taught by high modernists, or the tail end of high modernists. There's a neo-vernacular, as you call it. I think that's a good phrase for it, really. A kind of just sort of small c conservative, isn't it? It's like a lot of the stuff that the GLC was producing at that time, people are starting to look at it fondly compared with what happened under the London Docklands Development Corporation, that kind of wild neoliberal capitalism. But if you actually stand back from that stuff, it's awful.
It's completely awful. And I think, it felt like a kind of grasping at straws. Like if you weren't doing high modernism and you were trying not to be formalist, the whole problem with being taught high modernism was there was a kind of, there was still a line about it being very much about first principles and functionalism, but actually it was completely formalist. It was completely around kind of abstractions of what things should look like, of kind of forms of types of representation, how you represented materials as being authentic to themselves. Like, what does that matter to most people? And how you kind of thought abstractly about the volume and the kind of the way the light fell on the volume. So there were all sorts of things going on that were very internalized to architecture as a practice. And it was like we knew we didn't want to only do that. For me, and again, it's different for different people, because I didn't know why. They couldn't explain why. It was just like so obvious to them that they couldn't tell us why that was logical. And so we were just kind of, I don't know, struggling around trying to find anything that was more about ordinary life and ordinary people. Which of course was also very common at the time. There was a lot of that going on.
That postmodern switch to talking about the ordinary and the everyday.
And there was a kind of and there were people, there were kind of many more forms of public housing that were trying to be more kind of like ordinary housing, and again actually potentially very problematically. And I think for me it took a while to realize that if you were talking about ordinary lives and the diversity of ordinary lives, you weren't really talking about representation or kind of formalism at all, or kind of big concepts like, that it was authentic to use brutal concrete to represent the working classes, but that it was actually about everyday practices. It's about what people did and how they did it and what they needed in that process. And I think I still find that architecture tends to, it is also very inward. It's like it's the way that we think about built spaces, how architects think about built space and the things that matter to us. They're not wrong, but they're very, it's quite narcissistic. It's the things that matter to us that we value, and we value when we look at, when we assess kind of the quality of building projects.
So, I think this word narcissism, I've not really applied it before, but my wife's been reading quite a lot around narcissism at the moment. It's kind of on our minds at the moment. And I think there's quite a lot of them perhaps in public life, dare I suggest it. But what we're talking about, your project, the Disordinary Architecture Project, which really is the focus, I hope, of this conversation, comes off the back of this engagement with a kind of alternative mode of practice, which is based around activism and is based around trying to resituate architecture as a effective practice that responds to real life, that isn't sort of characterizing working class people as great heroes who need concrete in their life, and it's also not about just making gaudy things for the uber wealthy, I suppose.
Yeah, or gaudy things that are kind of somehow like a consumer item.
Yeah,
for the wealthy. And it's that thing I think about.
But how did you get to that point? So what are you're living, and you do your part 2 at the Bartlett as well? And
No, I didn't even get part 1. We were all incredibly radical. It was a course, it was one of the first modular courses in architecture, long before modular courses were the norm.
Mm-hmm.
And it was perfectly possible to just dodge all the courses that got you part 1 exemption, with the idea that you would do part 1 at a later date externally.
Uh-huh.
And I kind of knew quite early on that I didn't really want to become a practicing architect. And some of that was just for, it's just a personality thing. Like before I got into architecture, I'd worked in private catering, in cooking and kitchens. And I really liked the kind of hit you get off of things happening really quickly. Like you do a meal, you have the covers, it works or it doesn't work. And then you finished and you start again. And the time scale of architecture, I always knew that it wasn't going to work for me, you have to be very tenacious, not just because of the time, but because you're working with so many different people.
Mm.
So I knew that I loved architecture, but I knew that I didn't want to be a practicing architect. And, but at the same time, I think that kind of architectural activism has been central to everything that I've done, really. And I was one of the co-founders of something called Matrix, which was a feminist architectural practice in the 1980s in London. And that was a practice that really did look to how you might have a kind of radically different practice, mm-hmm. how it might be much more equitable, much more participatory, mm-hmm. And it arrived, I suppose I ought to know the dates, but it kind of arrived at a time when the Greater London Council, under Ken Livingstone, did have funds and was funding community groups to do to get buildings and to do feasibility studies for those buildings. So it was quite a fruitful period, really, in the through the 80s. It got much harder once Margaret Thatcher came in, but so there's quite a lot of really valuable buildings that Matrix designed. And I wasn't involved very much in the practice, but I was involved in the more research side. We wrote a book called Making Space, Women in the Man-Made Environment, which has just been republished by Verso. Just do a little plug there.
I'll plug it away, don't you worry. Plugs are good on here. This is what this is for.
Which is great as a feminist classic, so that's very nice. And actually there's been a lot of renewed interest in Matrix. We had an exhibition at the Barbican Art Centre in London, for example, and that generated a lot of other exhibitions with some Matrix work in it. So
who are the other members of Matrix?
Well, it's quite a long list, Ambrose. So, we also have a Wikipedia page. So
do you? There you
check it out. Because although it was generally around 5 or 6, maybe sometimes 10 as a total, it did run for about 10 years. So there were a lot of different women involved at different periods, and with quite diverse attitudes. But, a fantastic organisation. Where everybody was paid the same. There were a lot of very radical practices, some of which I think were quite difficult to implement. So being involved in that and being involved more in the writing side meant that I was very interested in trying to understand how space is gendered, because part of growing up in that period was this idea that the built environment was neutral, that what older, mainly white male tutors were telling us was, this was exactly, they were just doing something that was functional and correct. And it was like, wait a minute, no, there's certain assumptions here about, the women are always housewives, and that the men are always going out to work. They were at a time when those stereotypes were just no longer, they'd already been kind of they were already falling apart. I'm not sure they ever really worked. Maybe in England they worked through the interwar period, but they just weren't. And our generation, were just not interested, particularly women were just not, young women were just not interested in kind of fulfilling the sort of roles that many of our mothers had struggled under. So that thing, and I will get to disordinary architecture, that thing about trying to work out how gender plays out in space, and how, in a way, these things are always relational. It's how you begin to unpick everyday practices and then think about how that relates to how you design. What is it that you learn from that when the complexity of even the everyday is such that, we use these incredibly banal terms like user, because it saves us having to think about just how we manage the complexity of all the different ways that people occupy space.
Yeah.
So for me, that was about, what counts as normal and why it counts as normal and who gets valued and who doesn't, and how that does or doesn't get built into the physical environment, and then what the implications of that are, and then how you might do it differently. So that kind of leads on to the disordinary architecture project. And there was, there's also real life. Like, I was a single mum, I had no money. I did quite a lot of teaching as a way of surviving. I'd worked for Building Design, one of the trade journals for architecture, as a sort of cub reporter. So I did quite a lot of journalism, I did quite a lot of photography. It was possible, again.
You got to photography in the end. I think that's what we're all trying to do. We're trying to unpick the decisions our parents made for us when we were 15.
Yes.
You should do architecture. Really? Okay.
Yeah. No, I think that is right. I think it is like just, managing to get back into photography in another way. And I don't have regrets. Do you know what I mean? Well, and I'm very bad at this. Like some people, I think, they study architecture, they know they want to be an architect and they do it against all the odds. And I really respect them. But I just don't want to focus in on that one way. I think I'm interested in particular things, and obviously activism is central to that. And I don't really want to focus. So I actually lost the grant that I could have got to do a diploma in architecture because I got quite involved in stage management, and I tried to get it transferred to enable me to study stage management at RADA. And the funding authority, which was Surrey County Council, said, well, no, if you want to go and do something different, then we're just going to cancel this money completely. But
I like this thing that I'm picking up is this idea that you're looking much more at the idea of the social meaning of architecture and the idea of it as a relational practice rather than as a formalist artifact making practice. That architecture is first and foremost about the interrelation of the effective support, augmentation of social relationships.
Absolutely. And not just personal, social, spatial, political relationships, that every practice is not just, one function is much more than just the function or the ergonomics, but also that every practice is social and relational because it depends on the situation. It depends on the space, on the objects in the space, on the people that you encounter, on the services that are built into those spaces. And all of those things perpetuate. And it's this thing about, for me, it's about this thing about value. Who does get valued? And one of the things, the Disordinary Architecture Project came out of meeting a disabled artist called Zoe Partington in 2006, 2007. And just the pair of us ending up ranting about how weird it was that disability was still seen as this kind of apolitical, asocial, ahistorical thing. It was added on, it was added on as design guidance right at the end of a design process. So you're taught to design by, you design for normal people. And then when you finish designing for normal people, quote unquote, the disability studies view of normal people, it's called normates, once you've finished designing for a normate, at that point, you add on all the bits and pieces that make that environment, quote unquote, accessible for the people you've already excluded. I mean, that's weird, isn't it, that we do that? That just seems a really weird thing to do to me. And we felt that the way that although, the legislation's made some big differences in terms of what was, how diverse disabled people were able to access the built environment, it was kind of stuck. It was stuck in this really boring, politically correct place that meant that the way that you learned it, the way that students were learning it in 2006 was exactly the same way as I'd learned it in the 1970s. We're talking over 30 years with not a single, shift in kind of attitude. So, yeah, and so for me, that combination of things of recognizing that the way, the intersections between built space and humanity is through this, it's a series of relational encounters. And that does depend on the situation. They can be a place can be very inclusive. And we're not just talking disability, we're talking people of color, we're talking other non-normative groups or marginalized groups. It can be inclusive or not. And the physical design of the space and its services has varying degrees in which it matters in that process. So that's a complex set of unraveling that needs to be done. And it's a body of knowledge that we still don't really have. And in relationship to disability, actually, we do have it, because disabled people with very different opinions and perspectives and have been saying it, since disability campaigning started, in a big way in the 1960s. And again, those voices aren't listened to. And for me, I think the extraordinary thing was to begin to dip into disability studies scholarship, into disability activism, into disability arts, and see how much fantastic work that was going on that really connected with how, with the built environment. It might not be in a direct way, in the way that architects think about it or write about it or talk about it, but it was absolutely informative and rich. And I was just like, and that became a moment of thinking, right, it's kind of, I just like this stuff to be better known in the world of architecture, which is why I did the Doing Disability Differently book, and then the Disability Studies, no, it's not called that, whatever it's called, Disability in Architecture Reader, it was like, we just have to get some of this in there, because that will help how we think about it differently.
Well, this is, so to use a contemporary phrase, a bit of a head trip, because we do think, I was thinking whilst you were talking, I met a young woman on the train a week or so ago, and she was in a big wheelchair, one of those larger wheelchairs, and we got chatting about, she was just about to start university. And watching her get on the train, I was immensely impressed at the way that these machines, in a very short space of time, have been transformed so people with her accessibility issues are completely accommodated, like that. Didn't hold the train up. There was a guy, put down a ramp, on she gets, off she gets. Simple, and it was amazing. And then going into buildings and thinking about how little they've changed, so that it's still incredibly difficult for. So you can move at 125 miles an hour on a train as more effectively than not, but you can't get in and around buildings. And it just struck me as absolutely mind-blowing. And
yeah, although I do, it's like there are examples where things work, but it's also true, if you, because I mix with, a whole lot of very wide range of people, the reality of train journeys, compared to you, where you just get on, you may have to buy a ticket as you get on, but you just get on and you just get off. But in order to organize that sequence of events, that young woman would have had to phone up in advance, probably is doing it regularly so that they kind of got a bit more into sequence. And then the number of times that it doesn't work is enormous, and all the things that are vital as part of that, like the accessible toilets on trains working. Again, there's huge problems there. It sounds like a really weird thing to mention, but it's like
no, not at all.
Thing for people, for wheelchair users, is wheelchairs get trashed on anybody who takes a flight and uses a wheelchair. It's really likely that by the time they get off the flight, that wheelchair will have been damaged beyond belief. I mean, it's kind of like, why? What does that happen? So, you know, when you begin to kind of unpick the kind of complexities of it, I agree with what you say about buildings, but I also think that it's part of a deeper, you know, if you don't really respect the needs of people who have mobility devices, then you won't care much if disabled toilets aren't fixed very quickly, or if lifts aren't fixed very quickly, or if a wheelchair, which is a kind of vital tool, is damaged. And
but
so
you put this idea in you say in an article that you wrote, crippling spaces on disabling phenomenology in architecture. You quote a scholar called Thomas Abrams, who suggests that we have to stop seeing disability as a thing category, but as a mode of being. And I think that's really interesting, but I think it's really complicated. And perhaps you can enlighten us as to, like, how, I suppose, A, what that is, and B, how do you get there?
Well, I think there's two really key points about that. One is that it's a political issue, which is that we should value the richness of our neuro and biodiversity. And actually we don't. We tend to kind of focus on a kind of supporting a normal group of people, a normate group of people, and then kind of inviting in, but, you know, rather absent-mindedly, the others, the non-normal. So one thing is just about that, about how we might, what it means to think that we do actually value that kind of diversity, and that's something that is the richness of humanity, is something we should enjoy and not try and kind of close down. Then I think the second thing is that that if you start from difference, if you start from the outliers, particularly in design terms, it can be a really creative generator. So, for example, we've just finished Disordinary have just finished a temporary pavilion for a festival in Braunschweig in Germany for Theatre Formen. And we worked with two deaf architects, Richard Doherty and Chris Lang, as well as quite a lot of disabled artists from Germany. And we explored the concepts of deaf gain and deaf space. So deaf gain basically says there's a kind of idea that everything to do with a disability is a loss. And that actually, although it is often, you know, if depending on how and when you become disabled and what your impairment is, there are losses and frustrations, and, you know, there are bodily differences that affect what you can and can't do. But if you think about, so for people, deaf people who'd use a capital D, who sign, deaf gain is about how fantastic the kind of quality of, and it's a spatial thing, the quality of signing is, how exciting it is as a language, and a very generative language compared to written and spoken language, and how it's very performative, how it's very social, you're in a circle, how it has a lot of architectural aspects to it around light and around reflection and around color that make it a very kind of vibrant generator for design issues. So the theatre pavilion, I mean, we kind of looked at other supports that come out of, generated from different kinds of differences. But the core was around this notion of deaf space. What is a deaf space like? And that, for me, that's just so exciting. You know, it's like we should be learning from these, you know, the disabled people are often the kind of creative experts. We do a project with blind and visually impaired people, which is called Architecture Beyond Sight. It's a yearly study course for blind and visually impaired people who want to be architects or who are interested in architecture. And that one of the people who was involved in the development is a blind Portuguese architect called Carlos Pereira. And he just talked about how he does site visits. And they take about a week because they are, it's about absorbing the atmosphere of space, its qualities, its sound, its smell, its touch, its dampness, all the aspects of it. And so he really imbibes the site before he begins designing. And you just think, we could learn from that. There are many things, we work with some other architects, this was their ideas, not ours, called Manolo and White. They're a very interesting practice. And they won a design competition for a community theatre in Wales, based on doing an audio description, not a drawing. So they did an audio description. They described the space, and then they described what changes would be that they'd like to put into it. And what they said was that by doing it verbally, they just changed the whole way that they understood that space, because they were taking notice. They were paying attention to things that they wouldn't previously have thought about. So I know I'm going on at length, but for me, those are all really powerful tools that we're just ignoring by using the conventional methods, year in, year out that we use for design. And I think there's just so much to be learned, that you think of disability as something that's not just a problem to be solved, poor person that needs looking after, but it's actually both a creative generator for design and a real challenge to kind of everyday norms. It's like a really interesting place to start from.
Yeah. So the Disordinary Architecture Project is an ongoing project that does scholarship, activism, performance, consultancy. It does all of these things, or is it a sort of, maybe you could just describe it?
Yes, it's an informal platform is what I would say.
A what?
An informal platform.
Okay.
So it comes and it goes in terms of the amount of work that we do and the projects that we have. And we have a strapline which we co-developed back in 2007, 2008, which is that we promote new models of practice for the built environment led by the creativity and experiences of disabled and deaf artists. So there were two things in that. One is about models of practice. We don't do access guidance. We don't do access consultancy. We're not interested in that. We're looking at how you might actually change the way that built environment practices and architectural practices operate.
Yeah.
And we do that through bringing disabled and deaf artists and neurodivergent artists into built environment education practice, other sorts of clients or related stakeholders as a kind of collaborative act of engagement about how working directly with creative disabled people in an equal way can throw up all sorts of different ways of thinking. So when we started, we did an event, because a lot of it's also been developmental. It's like trying to work out how to do these things with impact. And I should say, we work with probably about 25 disabled and deaf artists on a regular basis. And disability arts in the UK, as in some other countries, is very vibrant. There's a lot of really excellent, world-renowned people working in that field, many of whom have a practice which has a kind of spatial dimension. So it comes out of the creative practice of those artists. It doesn't come out of them doing like, oh, well, this is my access needs. It comes out of their practice. And there's lots of videos on the website. So we got Arts Council funding over several years to work directly into built environment education at different levels and in different ways. And we do everything from what we call a hit squad, where we just, for very large first year groups, we bring in, 4 or 5 artists to work with them in an afternoon. And then we do artists in residency, where we get artists in for a longer period. either into hopefully we're just getting some funding to do it, into practices, but also into education. So we've just been developing kind of sets of activities, both foundational and more advanced, for developing those issues. And that's not just in the design studio, it's also in history and theory, it's in technologies. It's like how you might think about how just coming from a sense of disability and difference can open up new areas.
Yeah, that's really good. Really, I'm interested in something you said earlier in this idea of you've got to, it's much like Matrix. There's an idea that it's not just about having an add-on, like you design normative buildings and then you add on a bit that's for the ladies or add on a bit for the disabled people, but actually changing the way that we do practice. That is it about equality? Is it about equity? Is it about creating environments that are preferencing certain groups now, or is it are we simply talking about a totally different, imagining totally different way of even starting to think about design, as you suggest?
Yeah, I think our main aim, and obviously there's lots of people doing other, people doing work in terms of inclusive design and access, all of that work is important, but I think our main aim is about changing mindsets. So it is saying the underlying problem of all this is attitudes, and that attitudinal problem is both society-wide, but it's also the way those attitudes have worked their way through within different professional disciplines. So what is it? Where are these things? Where are the disciplinary behaviours and the kind of methods that you're inculcated with? Where are they actually stopping our engagement with difference being something that's creative and enjoyable rather than kind of deadening and dull in that way? That there's a kind of idea that as soon as you think about disability, you're going to be kind of blunting the creative edge.
Yeah.
And I think our whole point of view is that's how do we get to that? That's not actually logical. It's to do with the nature of architectural practice itself. So yeah, I think it is about it is like with Matrix. It is about saying it's saying we need to really shift practice, and that's it's not just, oh, we need to think about women, or oh, we need to think about people of colour, or oh, we need to empathise with the disabled. It's saying it's the very way that we work and the way that, the understandings we have about what it is to be a normal human being or to be a normal architect are really problematic. And that, that's there's a whole lot of stuff now rightly about unionising architectural labour, which again was something that was going on in the 1970s when I was a student and first starting into architecture. But there's a kind of, what is it to be an architect? You have to be kind of mobile and very busy and very independent and sort of unencumbered and obsessive, and you have to be able to work all hours of the night and day, and you have to be kind of just completely obsessed with this one subject. And if you have a chronic illness, or if you're partially sighted, you can also be that person, but it's much harder, and it's exhausting. I know, and part of the thing that's been amazing, I don't know why it didn't occur to me about the Disordinary Architecture Project, is how many people within architectural education and practice find it a safe enough space to disclose that they have an impairment. So I now know so many, people who are, for example, partially sighted, who don't tell their employers or don't tell their university. They tell their university, they get caught up in this whole horrible reasonable accommodations, reasonable adjustments process that just turns them into a kind of victim, and which is often ignored anyway. And if they mention it in practice, then it's really going to affect their employment opportunity. I mean, that's an indictment of the profession. I mean, it's an indictment of society. The profession's not the only people doing this. But if you're partially sighted, then actually, for example, CAD can be really helpful. But it's also just, it's extra exhausting compared to somebody. And if you're hiding it as well, if you're masking it, that's an added exhaustion. And those are like, we live in societies where, everybody is meant to self-actualize and they're individuals, and there isn't that kind of sense that we could support each other, and that that's not a problem, and that we don't need to be working all hours of the night and day. Maybe that's a myth about architecture that we could break, and that would open it up to a much wider range of people, creative people.
Well, it's a really interesting one, because it is kind of dependent on, as you say, a certain well, I mean, it's extremely gendered, for a start, and that's been obvious for a very long time. It's not entirely gendered, but that idea that, you know, you're going to work like an absolute cart horse all the time without any kind of variation in your energy levels, or it's crushing, actually. And it's why we have I suspect it's why we have such a high fallout rate from architectural education, because we perpetuate that by continuing to reify these demigods who they sort of have all of their humanity scrubbed away and are created as these kind of profoundly active figures rather than human persons. And it's a very, very strange, it's a very strange business, and it's such a bad business model. That's the other thing about it. It produces architecture that doesn't sell. I mean, it produces a service that doesn't sell. We don't reach beyond ourselves very well. So I'm really interested in that. I would just love to. I'm hoping that at some point we can have you and your project come to Kent, because I think it would be just an amazing starting point to sort of instigate a project around clearer understandings of this. But you also wrote another paper, and I wanted to ask you about this idea of phenomenology. So this is going back a little bit, but you wrote this paper, Disabling Phenomenology, and and you mentioned this, so phenomenology coming, I suppose, mainstreaming when you're at college, which is, and we still live with it. We use words like haptic and materiality and stuff like that. These are those words. And you posit the possibility that the paper suggests that this is problematic because whose sensory experience are we talking about here?
Yes, I don't think it's even about, I mean, it does relate to sensory experience, but I think it also relates to a kind of way in which often, and even in, philosophy, actually, the kind of Heideggerian phenomenology, and then the way Baudrillard, Bachelard, and others kind of turned it into an architectural phenomenology. There's a lot of slippage that goes on there, but I think that it is the kind of conceptual underpinning, if you like, is still really around an idea of, it's around the idea of archetypes. So, and it's quite interesting to think about archetypes, stereotypes, and users, and how, and perhaps in the Heideggerian way, that there's more nuance there, and obtrusiveness as well. But so when you look at something like Poetics of Space, which was certainly on our reading list as first years, along with the Zen of motorcycle maintenance, which I don't think gets taught anymore. And when you actually look at Poetics of Space, you can see that there's a kind of slippage between a notion of a particular childhood and the importance of a childhood experiences and the kind of way in which they affect as we grow up, and how important they are in terms of our intimate experience. And obviously I've been talking about, the everyday and intimate experience. But those archetypes, when they start talking about attics and cellars and our experiences of those, there's a kind of way of projecting that onto every person. It's like that's how we all understand it. So it becomes an abstraction that attics are kind of great hideaway places and cellars are frightening and full of demons. But if you read Poetics of Space, you will see there's a whole part at which, and it's only a few paragraphs, where Bachelard says, of course, there are people who don't live in places with attics and cellars. Like there are people who live in flats, for example, who've grown up in flats. And then he mentions refugees, because obviously he's writing in a period when there were a lot of refugees. And what he says is, well, he kind of either implies those people are not part of the archetype, or he implies that actually there's obviously going to be something wrong with them, because they haven't lived that experience. And the more you think about it, the more you think, actually, it's really odd, this experience of, who is it? Who is it that grows up in houses with attics and cellars? It's a very particular class, and the kind of understanding of it is actually very masculinist to me. It's very much a kind of set of assumptions that become generalized through the notion of an archetype as if it's something we all share. And the thing about those kinds of understandings of the world is, if you don't share it, then you often aren't given the space to say that. Like if you're at architecture school and this kind of text is offered to you as a really important way of understanding architecture, you've got to be pretty brave to stand up and say, that means absolutely nothing to me. I don't know what that's about. And there's a really interesting disability studies scholar called Tanya Tiskovsky, and she writes quite a lot about this idea of being included as excludable. So you have a way of describing the world and societies where it's about everybody, but actually everybody isn't everybody. Everybody turns out to leave quite a few people out. And that, again, comes back to my notion about value. It's like, how does that process happen, whereby when we talk about everybody, or we talk about the user or users, but somehow some people are just kind of left out of that. So I think that's, you brought it up already. It is, the research side for me is about unpicking some of those very deep things that affect our mindsets, that come out of a whole history of ways of thinking about the world that continue to perpetuate certain sorts of normative ways of thinking, even if they feel that they're not doing that, even if they're offered up as being quite radical.
Yeah, and this point that you make in the Disordinary Architecture project, with the tag on of building rigs, dealing with addressing the deficit of disability, rather than seeing it as you sort of beautifully described as offering forward new creative solutions. The actual impact of that is as far as I can see, as I understand it, if we tick the boxes on the planning form that says we've taken into account Part M requirements and we've put in a disabled toilet and a lift, then we're good. And we don't need to worry anymore. And I've seen this in contemporary buildings where the architectural intent is quite clearly ableist, like very distinctly ableist. And if you are a wheelchair bound person, or if you're pushing a pram, or if you are a bit heavy, or if you've got sore knees, or if you're elderly, then actually your journey through the building, the actual experience of the architecture is denied you, because you have to move right over there, get in the lift, travel very slowly up, whilst everybody else is getting to experience the unfolding of architectural space in a kind of nuance. And it's quite remarkable when you actually stop and look at it. And people don't, because it's been ticked on the box.
Yeah. And I think, and I'm sorry to pick you up on this, because
don't be sorry.
All these different things we're all in different ways of engaging. But so, for example, it's so embedded that we use the expression wheelchair bound, which implies that you're kind of stuck in a wheelchair. But anybody who uses a wheelchair would see it just like the rest of us see cars or bicycles, which is, it's a great mobility tool. You're not bound to it. It's something that really frees you up. So even in our everyday language, we tend to have ways of perpetuating that deficit.
Othering, as you put it.
Yeah, I think that's right. And we live so much in a world where the things are divided into these oppositional binaries. I mean, there's lots of work going on now, lots of, not just work, kind of activism around not saying, not just having men and women or black and white, or so we have these binaries, and then or able-bodied and disabled, and then we, it's like we almost have a system where somehow one has to be superior and the other inferior. We kind of, and it's built into the building blocks of everyday language, let alone how it then gets translated into design. So I think And then I think, I mean, what's interesting to me out of what you said, which I think is really important, but it's like the next step is, okay, how do we unpick all of that? Because obviously, and some of that's quite practical about how you unpick the building regulations, or how you might have systems for enabling them to be much more flexible. Like in Italy, they actually have a phrase in their accessibility guidance, which is something, I mean, this is me just paraphrasing, but if you suggest a better way of doing it, that will be allowed. So you're not stuck with the box ticking. So there are ways of doing it that are actually very straightforward. But we don't have that in place in terms of the way that we set up design guidance and standards in this country, for example. But then the other thing I think is about the fact that these things are, in a way, they are around disability and around other kinds of non-normative body minds, but they're also about the problem for architecture. And there's a whole history to be written of this, I think, about what you do about the complexity of humanity. So even if we're talking about disability, if we're talking about particular impairment categories, the reality is that the amount of variation within an impairment category is enormous. So a standard accessible toilet, following the guidelines in every way, which of course hardly ever happens, but still doesn't work for a whole load of disabled people, because the variety is so enormous, and it's trying to standardize that. And similarly, once you start working across impairment categories, you find there's lots of tensions and contradictions. The things that work for somebody who's blind don't work for somebody who's deaf. So, and then we're not even talking about the diversity of humanity as a whole, including, all able-bodied people in all their variety. So we have a kind of design, but also a kind of deeper philosophical, and I would say political, in its wider sense, kind of activist sense problem here. And I think that's what's really exciting for me, is that I mentioned disability studies scholars and activists and artists before, and there's a huge amount of really exciting work going on around how you might see access as something that is collective, that is about codependencies and vulnerabilities. It's something that we all have access needs, and we should stop just sort of thinking that we don't need them except those poor disabled people.
Yeah.
And that it's always uneven and difficult, and people will always get it wrong, like all people will get it wrong. And that what we need is a way of having a kind of understanding of an emergent and supportive process that means that we begin to gather different sorts of data and work with people and ask different sorts of questions. So Amy Hamrier in the States at the University of Vanderbilt, they have something called the Critical Design Lab, and they do quite a lot of stuff. They're very interested in crowdsourcing. If you start sourcing lots of data from lots of different people, they do it on the Vanderbilt campus, then what you end up is a lot of data that doesn't just fit neatly into kind of one solution. But what it does, if you're a designer, is it gives you a really, you have to make decisions like you do in all other aspects of design. It gives you a really valuable set of information that can help you design. Yeah. And that's what you do as a designer. You make partial decisions on partial variables, sometimes well and sometimes badly. And I feel like that's the way we need to think about occupation, the variety of occupation, and how we might take that into account in a much richer way in what we do.
Yeah. So, and as you point out in the paper, the phenomenology paper, there's this idea of shifting from a kind of an abstract, le modular kind of archetype to an architecture of care, to a process of care.
Yeah.
You talked to Juliet Davis on the podcast about this idea of care in urban design. I think this is very elegant, and it's something that I've been considering. There's a book out at the moment called Humankind, which kind of a reasonably recent book, I think. I don't know, it's written by some anthropologist, popular book. This idea that actually the driving force of evolutionary dynamic is care. It's not this thing that we've actually foregrounded in our understanding of the world, which is, the survival of the fittest, which when you stand back from it is both absurd and very rarely actually experienced. But care is something that we experience almost all the time. And so I think that switch around that you suggest in your paper, I think is a fascinating possibility. But I don't know what it looks like.
No, well, I don't. And I think, it's like that, we used to get asked it with Matrix. People would say, what does a feminist architecture look like?
Yeah.
We'd be like, feminist architecture is a process. It's not a look.
Mm-hmm.
And which is a bit glib, and it doesn't really solve the problem. But I feel like this is all, and some of it may look very similar to what we have now. But I think care is that notion that we move away from kind of solution driven and kind of, because solution, I know we always architecture is always about having to come to a solution, but thinking about it as a solution to something is a way of closing down a problem. Somehow I think we have to see buildings as being much, this is me being very idealistic, but I feel like there's some really interesting work, again, in disability studies from somebody called Kim Coleman about the Ed Roberts Centre, which was a building by disabled people in at the University of Berkeley in California. And what they increasingly found was, as it had been really designed around the needs of physically impaired people, mainly wheelchair users, because it was part of a whole campaigning group that was really vital in the 1960s and 70s, which was people in wheelchairs who were basically institutionalized, isolated, not allowed to kind of, get married and live together with somebody else. And so it was campaigning around that. And as other kind of impairment groups have become more activist, particularly neurodivergent groups, but also around, say, environmental sensitivities, the sense of how this building might change and adapt through time, and including the services, like they have disabled caretakers. Mm-hmm. And so a lot of the things that makes that all manageable and caring in a collective care way is by people who change, they change the furniture, or they check on what chemicals are used for cleaning the building. There's a kind of whole life process involved in thinking about these things. So it's not only that we shift towards a kind of sense of, principles of care and human flourishing rather than, economics and function and effectiveness. But if we're thinking about care and human flourishing, then we also have to connect to, I think, that process, that this is a long-term process and it will never be correct and it will never be the solution. And I think that overlaps so wonderfully with a lot of the stuff going around the circular economy and sustainability, and that sense that we shouldn't be knocking down buildings and building new ones, that we should be adapting, we should be doing low-tech kind of amendments and adjustments, and we should be not wasting materials in the process. There's a really interesting area that I'm just getting involved in now called discard studies, which is concerned with waste, and it relates to what I was talking about value at the beginning. Who counts as waste? Who isn't really taken, both human and non-human? What is human and non-human waste? Well, it's being homeless, it's being poor, it's being disabled. There's a whole set of sort of groups, just as there's, human waste, material waste, and that we need to really look at those in a much more activist and a political way, much more than just, recycling cardboard boxes. That it's a kind of way of looking at the world, that it's absolutely centered on what you were saying around care, around what does that mean? What does it mean to support human flourishing in our everyday work? However tiny that is, that happens. Lots of people are in positions where they can't do that. But in terms of where you can just be activist in that direction, What does that mean in terms of architectural education and practice? I think it means quite a lot. I think it has quite a lot of potential.
I think that's a lovely point to finish on. Thank you so very much, Jos. That was wonderful.
Nice to speak to you, Ambrose.
It's always an honour and a privilege to hear Jos speak, so a great many thanks to her for coming on the show. Please see the podcast description for links to the Disordinary Architecture Project website, Jos's professional profile, and links to other recordings and articles Jos has on the World Wide Web. And once again, thanks for listening. Cheers.